Hey folks, it's Fernando doing another video here for More Survivalists, and here I have a question that I got through email asking about relocating. It says, if you were to bug out to a Central or South American country, which one would it be and why? I know that you mentioned that it would be unwise to leave the United States. I have agreed with you and still do if it wasn't for the reason we are considering it. The reason we're considering it, well, basically he explains that it's a purely spiritual and religious one, and asking as a Christian, which country would I go to? Well, of course you understand that in most of Latin America you have quite a bit of a Catholic population. It really depends, but I think that in Mexico it's like 85%, and still a majority in most Latin American countries. The majority of the population is Catholic. Sometimes you have quite a bit of a difference. I think that in Uruguay it's like 40% of the population, or around those numbers. In Argentina it's around 80%. I think that for Chile it's 70%, give or take. But in general, you could say that most people have either been baptized Catholic, or are practicing Catholics, or even if they're not actively involved, basically the culture is, in terms of the Christian culture, it revolves around Catholicism. And now this is important, I'm mentioning it because many times folks use the word Christian, and the thing is that it's a pretty broad term, and a lot of people that consider themselves Christians or define themselves as Christians, I've learned through the years, many folks that call themselves Christians are nothing like what I would consider them. There's really nothing Christian about them in many ways, right? At least not in the traditional sense. But since there's not a specific parameter for someone to be or Christian or not, other than himself saying, yes, I'm a Christian, or I consider myself a Christian, then that's a difference. So I'm explaining this so as to make it clear that what you're likely to encounter in Latin America. In Latin America, you're likely to encounter a Catholic culture, all right, from a religious perspective, even as a social one. If you're being invited to a baptism, every kid that's being baptized, 90% of the chances he's going to be baptized in a Catholic church. Or if he's taking a first communion or getting married, really, even for people that are not practicing, people that are not particularly religious, they just go to church just to get baptized and just to get married. It will still revolve around those, all right? So that's the kind of thing to expect. Now, regarding the question of where would I go, I understand that religion is important, and clearly based on the email, I understand that. But it's not the entire. It's an important part of the equation, I guess, so as to be integrated to the society. If you have a strong religious beliefs that are similar to those of the rest of the population, of course, that's going to be helping a lot with integration of where you're going. But that's of course not all there is to it. Where would I go? Trying to answer specifically the questions and why. Well, as you clearly saw and understood, I wouldn't be leaving the United States. And if I was leaving the United States, I wouldn't be going to Central or South America. Most definitely not, especially because I have left Argentina in Latin America, and I could have gone to some of the other nearby countries, which in many ways would have made things so much more easier for me, because it's in spite of being different countries, it's the same language, and pretty much the cultural similarities are still there. I'm just explaining this so as to make it clear why is it that I wouldn't go. Why is it that I wouldn't choose Latin America as a destination? Especially because it's places in which there's still all the problems, or at least most of the problems that I was trying to leave behind when I left Argentina, in terms of crime, in terms of corruption, in terms of instability. That pretty much it's widespread throughout Latin America in general. Even though you have countries that are better off than others, it's nothing like United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. Those countries are much more stable. There's quite a bit of a difference. Now, having said all this, if I had to choose one in Latin America, which one would I go for? First of all, I would really be very careful regarding the classic countries that are advertised very heavily in the American press, and this is usually because of publications, and usually it's a lot of investments going on. When you have Panama, Panama is huge right now, and people are going nuts over it. Lots of real estate being sold for folks over there. In Costa Rica as well. You have all these Central American countries where there's a lot of promotion, and they're showing these wonderful pictures of the beach, and it all looks very, very fabulous, all very fantastic, and you're thinking, I'm going to be living the rest of my life in a tropical paradise. It's just a picture, all right? All those tropical paradise, it's just a picture, and behind all those palm leaves and such, there's usually a lot of poverty and misery. So in general, I would avoid most of Central America, all right? It's just too unstable, in spite of the things that are so heavily advertised, and in spite of there's quite a bit of an expat community in many of these places, which can help to a great degree. I mean, don't get me wrong, if you're set on moving to Panama or Costa Rica or Puerto Rico or wherever it is that you have in mind, even Mexico, and you're set on going there, and you find yourself a good American community, which makes things so much easier for you, and you adapt quickly. You already have friends there, they speak your same language, and you're basically it's like being home for you. That is a huge advantage. That's going to be very important. That's going to be making things so much easier for you. Now, having said all that, I would not go for these places. Simply why? Because they have lots of these problems that you're not going to be escaping, even if you are mostly sticking to a community that's familiar to you. Even if you're staying close to an American expat community, you still have to deal with the corruption, you still have to deal with the crime, and all these problems will still affect you. So if I had to go for Latin America, I would go, probably my first choice would be Uruguay. Uruguay, it's pretty stable, all things considered, considering that it is Latin America. Uruguay is pretty stable. It has it's been called the Switzerland of Latin America. Yeah, it's nothing like Switzerland, but mostly because of it being where all the banking, all the shady banking in many ways takes place. But besides that, it is pretty safe in general. The cost of living is still quite high, which really brings it down quite a bit. You do have cheaper places to live than Uruguay. Uruguay is not particularly cheap, but it is pretty safe, all things considered, even though crime has been getting worse in these past years. Chile would be another good option, but the thing with Chile is this. Chile still has many of the problems, like everywhere else in Latin America. It has the problems of in many ways corruption, but the problems are familiar to third world countries, like everything taking forever. If you want to get cable installed, it takes forever. If you want to open a bank account, it takes a million years. Every single thing that you want to go, you're going to be finding insane bureaucracy all over the place in a way that I just simply cannot explain. All over Latin America bureaucracy for absolutely everything will drive you mad. You're not used to it. Here, I just pick up my phone, call, and have things done. Make payments just like that. It doesn't work that way over there. It's everything. It's lines, queues, waiting in stores that are closed, banks that are closed, and you have to pay this over there, and over there doesn't even exist, or it's opening the following day, and that's the story of your life. 30% of your time is going to be wasted like that, and it will drive you nuts. All right. So these are all warnings that I make so as to avoid you these unpleasant surprises. In Uruguay, it's somewhat of a little bit better. In Argentina, it's pretty disastrous in general. Everything takes days to get done, and of course, you do have the problem of crime. Chile would be safer than Argentina, definitely so. Still, you do have more crime than in developed countries. It's also quite expensive as well. Chile, it's a pretty expensive country. Now, for people that have either a lot of money or are particularly well suited for Chile because they have good business opportunities there, maybe you can make a case for it. Now, at the same time, Chile has several things that I really don't like. It's a very restrictive country. I mean, it was a dictatorship until not really that long ago, and it still has that dictatorial way of doing things, of the government handling itself. The government is very heavy-handed. It's pretty heavy-handed with people in general, and not in the way in which the conservative Americans would like it to be. It's heavy-handed in the sense of the cops slapping you around because you're a foreigner kind of deal, which you probably will not enjoy. So all these things make Chile a little bit less weird. Some people simply love it. I mean, some folks from Argentina just moved to Chile because it was safer, because they were making more money over there, and they just freakingly love Chile, and they think it's fantastic. Again, it still has most of the problems of Latin America in terms of bureaucracy, corruption, quite a bit of crime as well, and it's pretty expensive. Besides that, you have the problem of constant earthquakes in Chile, all right? And it's not just one big one every few years. It's a big one that destroys half the country every few years, and then you have these smaller ones all year round, which kind of drives you nuts. I know of people that have lived there and just couldn't stand it. I mean, it's a nerve shattering to deal with that kind of thing. So the bright side of Chile is that economically speaking, it's maybe one of the more better off countries in Latin America. Chile, it's one of the most evolved countries economically speaking. Politically speaking as well, it's kind of getting there. Chile, at least some would consider that Chile is going from the transition of being a third world country, developed nation, to a developing nation to a developed one. I'm not so sure about that. I don't think it is. I don't think there really is a way in which you can say that Chile is a full-blown developed nation like the ones that United States and Europe and such. I don't see how you could possibly make a case for that, but some folks are trying to make that, and it is one of the better off countries. Uruguay would be kind of similar to Chile. It's also pretty expensive as well. Not as expensive as Chile. In Uruguay, you can make a living with less money, but you have to understand that the conditions in which you're going to be living are going to be quite different. All right. In places like Uruguay, there's people that will tell you, yes, we can live with $1,000 here. With $1,000, you live in Uruguay. Correct. Yeah, but what kind of life are you living? I mean, these are folks that won't even have a car. all right, and their expenses are very much restricted. No fancy Wi-Fi or cable. So yeah, you can live with little money in Uruguay, like lots of people, lots of locals do. But you're not going to be living the fancy lifestyle of many expats that are millionaires living in Uruguay in Punta del Este. That's going to be a different cost of living. At the end of the day, this is one of the reasons why I just don't see the point in Latin America, because so as to live well in Latin America, you're going to be spending more money than living well in developed nations. All right, so as to live well in Uruguay, I mean having a nice house or apartment in Montevideo or some other somewhat good neighborhood, having a car that actually runs rather than a rust bucket, that's going to be more expensive than in the United States. So for that quality of life, it's going to be cheaper for you to live in a cheap U.S. state than in Uruguay, let alone Chile, even Argentina as well. Then again, it's Uruguay. What it has going for it is that it's a beautiful place. Its crime is getting worse, but really not as bad as in some other parts of Latin America. And the people of Uruguay in general are very easygoing. Pretty much inclusive, which you can never take for granted. That's one of the nice things about it. So you have a good lifestyle in Chile if you have in Uruguay, if you have the money for it. It's again not going to be nearly as cheap as you think. Even Argentina, you could make a case for it, and I'd like to take this opportunity to mention that right now this is a year of elections in Argentina. Cristina Kirchner, she has no way of staying in power, and she's going to be running with her suitcases full of gold and diamonds or whatever. And there's maybe a chance of someone more serious, a more professional, ending up running things, and maybe 10 years down the road, Argentina improving quite a bit in terms of corruption and crime. You know, most of all corruption. The problem in Latin America in general is corruption. You just cannot deal with that. It just contaminates everything else. So maybe in Argentina you could make a case for that as well. If you're looking at living in if you just want to have your cabin in the woods and be left alone, maybe in Patagonia, south of Argentina, you could make a case for that. You have, if religion is really so important, you do have these smaller conservative little towns in Patagonia that probably could suit you well. You know, it really depends on what you're looking for. Even there, you're going to be having all these problems that I always talk about. The messy government is all over the place. It doesn't matter, and usually the smaller it is, the more the more sleepy it becomes. I mean, everything takes weeks or months instead of just days, as it would probably do just living in Buenos Aires. So yeah, if you're just forcing me to give you an answer regarding this, probably my first choice would be Uruguay. All right, you do need the money for it. It's by no means ideal, and it's not particularly religious. I think that Uruguay is like 40% Catholic, like 10% other Christian denominations, and there's quite a bit of people that are not particularly religious. Uruguay is maybe one of the least religious countries in Latin America. First option would be Uruguay. If you have a lot of money and it doesn't bother you to not get much more in exchange for that, I mean, and it is so awfully expensive. I just cannot see how or why you would want to be going to Chile, but maybe Chile makes a good option for you. Argentina, still you have all this awful crime that it just turns me away from it. But Argentina would probably be in some parts, if you want to be living a little bit more isolated, you could make a case for some parts of Argentina. And finally, mentioning here Colombia as an option. I keep hearing great stuff about Colombia, and it has improved a lot from its dark times where the drug cartels were just making a mess out of it. Colombia, by all accounts, it's doing quite well. So maybe that's something to look into as well. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a perfect answer, and for every good thing that you can find of living in any of these places, in Uruguay, in Chile, in Argentina, or even in Colombia, for every good thing, there is gonna be a 3 or 4 things that probably will ruin it even for you. So be very careful about where you end up moving, especially when going to these places where it's really not as easy, and especially not as easy for someone coming from the United States, from someone coming from a developed country where things naturally work. You have a problem, you pick up your phone, you talk with someone, and you get it fixed. That doesn't exist anymore. You have to just walk to offices, walk to buildings. It's been so long, and you're basically used to things not working. You're basically used to having little supply of everything. You walk into a grocery store anywhere in Latin America, and they have, a fifth of what you would be finding in terms of variety anywhere else. And then you go and buy a car, and you're going to be wondering, why is it that I'm paying 5 times as much for an old beat up car that would cost a few $100 in the United States? I'm here paying a few $1,000. A car that maybe costs in Europe or the United States $500 or something like that can easily cost $3,000 or $4,000 in Latin America. Everything is, especially anything that's more manufactured and processed, it's going to be quite a little bit more expensive, and you either have to have a lot of money or you have to get used to doing without, which is what most people do in these places. They just get by without much of a cell phone, without much of a car, without much of a place to live in, and they just live their lives with a lot less than what people in developed countries are used to, especially people from the United States. And that's gonna be basically it, guys. That's my suggestion for where to go. Again, it's something that you really should look into very carefully. As always, I recommend my book, Bugging Out and Relocating. The link is going to be there below. And this is something that will give you a good head in terms of thinking of what you're looking for, and if you're going to be finding it in these places that you're thinking of going. When you look at the chapter of corruption, and this is a lot of these charts that I use in the book are available online. For example, the Transparency International charts showing the corruption by country that I do include in the book. It's available online. You can look it up yourself. And if corruption is very bad in whatever country you're considering going, then you should really give it another thought, because you just cannot work around corruption. Corruption means crime, corruption means violence, corruption means a government that just doesn't get things done, and it's a world of misery in many ways. Homicide rates by country as well, figure that I would most definitely look into, as well as some other good stuff. Folks, that's going to be all for now. Take care, subscribe, share the video. See you in the next video. Have a great day.